Welcome to the screencast for How Not to Answer Moral Questions and Moral Isolationism. With this screencast, we're starting a new unit about moral theory. And the first article by Tom Regan can be found on page 331 in our textbook. So we all probably have an intuitive sense of what morality and ethics are. Philosophers, though, like always, speak about them in a little bit more technical of a way. There are two main branches when people study moral theory. The first one is the more abstract, and the second is the more concrete. So when we talk about moral theory or moral theorizing, we are trying to figure out what we mean when we're talking about the way the world ought to be. What is morality itself? At its simplest, some philosophers think that value theory is the underpinnings of moral theory. And all value theory is when we look at the world or we look at ourselves, our personalities, and we think that some situations or characteristics are good or bad. We're placing a value on something. Now, facts out in the world, like how many millions of miles away the sun is, or what the unit of a kilometer measures, don't have values. We don't say they're good or bad. They're just features of the world. But when we put something onto the world and we say this is good or this is bad, we're evaluating them. And you can evaluate objects like a knife. A good knife is sharp and cuts, whereas a bad knife is dull and doesn't cut. When we move to what we think is good human behavior and bad human behavior, of course, things are a little bit more complicated. Ethics, the second major branch of morality as philosophers study it, are trying to focus on the contents of moral theories. Which specific type of rules should we follow in the world if we want to build good societies and become good people? How do we actually implement right and wrong in the world? So our first article by Tom Regan is in the more abstract vein. This screencast right here, we're going to stick to moral theory. We're not necessarily going to have a positive definition of what moral theory and moral judgments or moral beliefs are, but we're going to try and weed away what they aren't, what can't possibly answer our questions about morality. So we're sticking in the first part with Tom Regan and with our next author, Mary Midgley. So he's going to tell us what moral judgments are not. There are some common perceptions that Regan thinks of as misperceptions. And one of the first ones are that personal preferences or opinions are not the same thing as moral judgments. A lot of people will argue or debate over a specific point, and then they'll say, well, we've gotten to the point where it just comes down to opinion. And Regan gives us an argument as to why this is not the case. So, in short, here's the conclusion. Personal preferences or opinions can never be wrong, whereas moral judgments can be right or wrong, even if we don't agree on them. So we've gotten his conclusion in this first section. What are the premises that he uses? Okay, so if person A likes the Beatles and person B does not, both of them are right in their opinions. They're the opposite of one another, but they can both be accurate. So a normal fact isn't like this. A ball can't be red and not red at the same time. So right off the bat, there's a difference between opinion and a fact out in the world. So which one is morality? Is morality like a fact out in the world, or is morality more like an opinion where two people can hold contradictory ones and they're both right? So preferences are not truth apt. I can like Pepsi and you can like Coke, and we can both be right. There's no true or false when it comes to your own opinion. Now, all truth apt means is that the statement in question can be true or false. It can't be both at the same time. Now, if we look at a moral judgment, and person A thinks that abortion is always wrong, and person B thinks abortion is morally permissible in some contexts, both of them cannot be right at the same time. One of them has to be wrong. It might be really complicated and we might not have come to a conclusion, but when we believe something morally, we are invalidating other people's beliefs that are opposite to us, unlike in the personal preference case. So moral statements, then, are truth apt. They're trying to say something about the world, not just about my opinion. Opinions can never be truth apt, while moral statements are. Another premise that Regan uses is that we expect people to justify their moral beliefs. So back to the abortion case, if you're debating with someone who has a differing opinion to you, you ask them what their reasons are. Whereas if it's a band or a color that someone likes, you're never going to ask them for their reasons. You're never going to want justification for a personal preference. But moral beliefs seem to be the kinds of beliefs we expect to be justified. So those are two big differences where moral preferences, or moral judgments are something out about the way we think the world actually is or should be. So if it's about the world, we can investigate and we can find reasons that better support our conclusions, just like when we're investigating a factual matter. His second category of what moral judgments are not is just the fact that someone thinks something doesn't mean that it actually makes it morally justified. Okay, so if person X thinks some belief is moral, and here's an example, Bonnie thinks that you can't be a good person unless you make sacrifices to help others. Clyde, another person, thinks you can still be a good person even if you don't make sacrifices to help others. So what's the moral bit of these judgments? If it was about what people just think, then they can both be correct. They might both have their reasons, so it might not just be an opinion. It might be a well thought out argument. But we want to get to the moral bit. What is the moral judgment in here? And it can never be just the fact that someone really truly believes it. Because if you look back at those statements, they both truly believe the opposite things. But remember back to the last section, if we're trying to say something about the world, your statements are either true or false, so they can't both be true at the same time. So moral judgments can never be about what any one person thinks is moral. It's not the thinking that makes it a moral judgment. It's something else. We haven't quite got to what that other thing is, but now we know that moral judgments or moral beliefs are one, not personal preferences or opinions, and two, it's not an individual person holding that belief. This matters because even though we might not automatically be swayed by one person believing something, when a big group of people thinks that something is moral or immoral, this seems to provide more evidence. And Regan thinks it does not, because it's just the same thing as before. A lot of people thinking that something is moral or immoral. So when we ask a group what they think, it's not about the way the world actually is or should be or ought to be. We're just asking what a group thinks. So again, that can't be true or false. Our thoughts are our thoughts no matter what they are. So we can't learn any facts about a world and how morality fits into it if all we care about what the group believes. So someone believing in something is never a good justification for any statement. They have to give reasons. Remember, the reasons are key. It's not just the fact that somebody believes it, even if they're an expert in their field. It's also that their reasons and their justification is good as well. The final thing that Regan tells us moral judgments are not is an appeal to a moral authority. So, first off, what is a moral authority? It would be an abstract or concrete entity or person that never makes a mistake about moral situations. They're like a guidepost that's permanently affixed to whatever is good. And this means if we had such an entity, a real moral authority that never made a mistake, we could always look to them and know what was right and what was wrong. Now, of course, in a lot of human history, our concepts of divinity and God have been appealed to as a moral authority. Regan doesn't want to tell you that you shouldn't use religion in your life to help shape you in the direction you think you should be going, but he doesn't think it can possibly qualify as a universal standard for morality. Now, why would we need a universal standard? I want you to think back again to the idea that something about moral judgments responds to the world in the same way that scientific facts do. There's something true and false in our moral judgments. And to decide which judgments are true and which judgments are false, we look for justification. So that sort of argument, where we're looking for justification to find the best supported beliefs, that's responsive to reason, and reason is universal. So when we're looking for a universal rule for morality, we can't use the appeal to a moral authority because of the following reasons that Regan gives. Okay, the first problem with appealing to a moral authority is that not everybody believes in the same God, or sometimes not even any God at all. So that already means we're not at universal rules with good universal justifications for them. We want to define it for everybody. What is right and what is wrong? Even if we could choose one ultimate moral authority, if we could somehow figure out which religion's God is the correct moral authority, there are problems of human interpretation, and there always will be. So we could look to this moral authority and ask them what is right and what is wrong. But if they give us their words to tell us, we're always going to be interpreting it, and we are not perfect. So we can take a real world example. In the Bible, in Christianity, there's a passage that talks about man having dominion over the earth. And that's been interpreted variously as meaning men and humanity should be able to use the earth's resources however it sees fit. And it's also been interpreted to mean that we are caretakers of the earth and we should be more careful in how we use its resources. So those are almost exact opposite interpretations of the word of the divine. The next argument against using moral authority as a universal standard of morality is how no sacred text has ever been comprehensive enough. We run into new situations all the time. Regan uses technology as an example, so cloning or stem cells. If we want to apply the word of our moral authority to these new novel situations, it falls right back into problem number 2, human interpretation. And the last reason we can't use a moral authority, Regan says, is because we can't check to make sure that the moral authority is right. There's no outside objective standard to show that the moral authority is never wrong. So now we are probably a little bit more lost than we started with, because we learned what morality isn't. That's a negative argument. I mean, I'm being a little facetious when I say it, because of course he's using that negative argument to explain why some common understandings of morality just won't work if we're really looking for a universal standard. Our next article, Moral Isolationism by Mary Midgley, on page 335, she tackles another widespread theory about what morality might be, and she also argues against it. So we still haven't gotten a positive argument as to what moral judgments are, other than that real basic understanding that when we make a moral judgment, we're saying how we think the world ought to be. So moral isolationism is also called cultural relativism. It's the idea that because morality is so different in different cultures, there can never be a universal guide. It's always relative. Right and wrong only matters when you're sealed up inside of your culture. And your culture of today is what determines what's right and what's wrong. And that means there's no such thing as a universal morality. It's always only dependent on cultural norms. And she acknowledges that moral isolationism often comes from a good place. We don't want to be imperialistic or colonial and just run roughshod over other people's cultures that might upset our own sensibilities. So our own Western system of values has evolved to value the respect and tolerance of other cultures. But Midgley says we can't even do that if we can't understand them at all, because the basis of respect is understanding. You can't you can't respect something you completely have no understanding of. Respect means that you're using your own values and your reasoned judgment to say something is tolerable. But if you can't use your values and you can't use your reasoned judgment, you can't be making any sort of decision on other people's culture. Okay, so MI, or moral isolationism, proposes that you can only understand a system of morality if you grow up and live within it. That makes cultures incommensurable with one another, and that means there's just no overlap. There's no way to communicate. The values are so different that we just can't even understand one another's reasons for what we do. There's zero common ground. You might go back to the "What does it mean to be a bat" article, where you can think of an alien species so radically different and foreign to us that we can't even find a way to communicate with one another. This is sort of how moral isolationism views different moral systems. They can't communicate because what seems abhorrent to us, like female genital mutilation, is a product of growing up in that culture. But Midgley says to respect someone, you need to know enough about them to make a favorable judgment, however general and tentative that favorable judgment is. So how much do you need to know? Now, she uses an example throughout the article, and she doesn't want something emotional like genital mutilation or abortion, or infanticide, or anything that people might have a strong opinion about already. So she picks something a little bit more remote. She picks Japan in the time of the samurai. So I think this is the Middle Ages for Westerners. They had a word. I can't pronounce this properly, of course. I would guess sujiri. But anyway, this word means to try out one's new sword on a chance wayfarer. So that means you get a new sword as a samurai, and you can just go and kill someone who's walking or traveling on the path. And obviously this seems abhorrent and awful to us at first glance. The person who would be trying to explain this might say that honor was a highly important value to the samurai. And if their blades didn't perform in the way that they were supposed to, they felt as if they were letting down family, ancestors, and their emperor. So they felt like bad people if their sword did not perform properly. And properly meant that in one stroke you should be able to cut someone in half. Now, a proponent of moral isolationism would say we don't understand it because we're not immersed in it, and there's no way we could because the time of the samurai are gone. So right off the bat, this might seem like a tempting answer. You're right, okay. There's probably maybe some overlap between our current culture and cultures around the world throughout 5, 10, 15,000 years of history. There's probably a lot we can't understand because we're just too far removed. Well, Midgley thinks that this tempting answer is still incorrect. Okay, so if we can't judge them, presumably they can't judge us. But often we accept in the West when people from outside come in and judge us negatively. Sometimes when they've only been around for a short period of time. She has an example on page 336 where in Brazil there was a South American Indian. So there are dozens of tribes in South America that aren't assimilated into contemporary culture, and they still live in more or less traditional ways in the jungle. And one of these Indians came into a Brazilian modern town and made a judgment after a couple of weeks, saying that the Brazilians' modern way of life was awful, detached, etc. And one reporter said, a damning indictment of Western civilization came from this South American Indian. And Midgley thinks that they might have been justified, the Native American, but we can't really let them get away with that if moral isolationism is true. One, because if we can't judge them, they can't judge us either. They don't understand our culture. They're not a part of it. 2 weeks, 3 weeks is not going to give them the immersive understanding of our culture. And two, if you think, well, okay, an outsider can judge things. Maybe they just need a little bit more time to observe and understand. 2 weeks isn't a good enough time. And it should work both ways. If we provide reasons to one another and we all use the same kinds of reasons as to what's right and what's wrong, we're admitting that cultures are not incommensurable, that we can communicate with one another. You can have more or less rudimentary understandings, of course, so that Native American that only had 2 weeks probably has a more rudimentary understanding of Western culture than someone who's lived there for years. But we can still learn, we can always learn more. We can always gather more justifications, more reasons, more explanations to get a less rudimentary and more sophisticated understanding. To take another tenet of MI, if we can't understand other cultures, if we can't judge them because we don't understand them, then how can we judge even our own culture? There are lots of things about our own culture that are too complex and too confusing that we don't really fully understand them. We might talk about gun violence, why it's prevalent, what we should do about it. No one person seems to have really a full grasp on the entire issue because it's complicated and hard to understand. So that means we can't make moral judgments about our own culture. Further, another reason, so we've already gotten 2 or 3 reasons as to why moral isolationism just doesn't work. Moral improvement wouldn't be possible underneath it. If we have zero other groups to compare ourselves with, nobody around the world, no cultures in the past, not even our own culture from the past, because we can't understand them. All we can understand is the culture we grew up in, and we only barely understand that. That means if we can never compare, we can never change, because we can't say anything's better or worse. We have nothing to compare it to. And finally, moral isolationism is already a moral judgment. You can't get outside of moral judgments. When we express our value that we shouldn't steamroll other cultures, we're expressing a moral judgment. We're saying what is appropriate moral behavior. So the best course has to be to inform yourself as much as you can and find good justifications for your beliefs. Midgley says, real moral skepticism, in fact, could only lead to inaction, to our losing all interest in moral questions, most of all those which concern other societies. So if you truly believe there was no universal anything, nothing universal to morality, if you're a complete moral skeptic and relativist and you think it's just a thing that happens to happen in cultures, and if a culture drifted so far away so as to say some murder is okay, we couldn't even evaluate them. If you were that much of a moral skeptic, all we could ever do is stop acting in moral ways and lose all interest in moral topics, because we can't judge ourselves, we can't judge others, we can't improve, and we can't compare and contrast or learn anything about it. So the final thing we need to worry about is that moral isolationism already isn't the case. So if we go back to the samurai, and Midgley does this on page 338, and we encounter a historian that tells us about this practice of slicing up travelers, the scholar of the period will attempt to justify it to us. They would give us reasons. And again, giving reasons is already communicating, showing that these cultures, even though they're far apart in time and in place, are not incommensurable. Midgley says on page 228, oh, that should be 338. I'm not sure how I got that so wrong. She says, if we accept something as serious as a moral truth about one culture, we can't refuse to apply it, however different an outward form, to other cultures as well, wherever circumstances admit it. So if we learn a moral truth about somebody, it's a truth. It's true or false about the world itself, and that means when it applies to us or to other cultures, it's still true or false. We'll be using our own standards no matter what. We can only proceed from where we are. We'll never be a part of Japanese samurai culture, and we'll be using our own Western standards to understand it. The historian or the scholar might say, travelers implicitly accepted or consented to possibly being a test case for the samurai's sword, because the samurai were so highly valued in that culture. Midgley points out that the idea of consent wouldn't make any sense to a medieval Japanese person. We're using our lens and trying to reason as to why there's some common ground. So from our two articles, we found a few things out about moral judgments. First, they're not like preferences. Instead, we think they're true or false. They aren't group opinions, and they're not isolated to cultures. Our beliefs about morality are about the world, even if we disagree about them. And there are better and worse justifications for any particular moral belief. So now we have a bit of a grasp about what we think moral beliefs and judgments are. Now we're going to look to figure out which ones are right and which ones are wrong. So we're going to look at particular moral systems or ethics. that will help us live life more closely to what we think ought to be. So we're going to look for rational justification to apply morality universally. As always, please ask questions in the comments. This one is a little longer than normal, so I know there's a lot in there. And if anything confuses you, do not hesitate to ask questions.